Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old, and today I'm talking about the mini-album from Squarepusher, Budakhan, Mindphone. Right, so this is kind of a weird release to be dedicating an entire video about. It's classified as an album in Squarepusher's catalog, but sometimes it's classified as an EP. Because, it's only 7 tracks, about the length of an EP, but the cover credits it as a mini-album. And yeah, even though I've been kind of iffy with releases of around this length, and whether or not I think they have enough material to cover, I of course thought this particular release to have enough material to cover. Now of course the thing about Budakhan Mindphone is that even though there are only 7 tracks on here, there's actually more to say about it than you'd expect, as the 7 tracks are fairly distinctive. Now, of course, the main reason I actually wanted to set aside an entire video for this is purely on the merits of the opening track on this thing, Iambic 5 Poetry. Iambic 5 Poetry is seriously one of my favorite tracks of all time, I think. And it's interesting because it sounds almost nothing like anything else Jenkinson's ever done to my knowledge. Possibly My Sound from Music is Rotted One Note, but even that feels like a lesser version compared to this. I wouldn't say it's the kind of track that exemplifies every quality about the guy that I've always enjoyed. No single track I think is capable of that, honestly, and this one is pretty unusual for him, too. But my god, Iambic 5 Poetry is such a freaking amazing track that makes the entirety of Budakhan Mindphone worth checking out purely just for that one track. Played entirely with live instrumentation, the intro gives us a little plucked bass line, followed by waves of synth chords and echoey drums, really setting up this dreamy and ethereal vibe. Not much really seems to happen for a little bit, but then, suddenly out of nowhere, the bass line comes back in, accompanied by this amazing marimba melody, which is actually the same melody as the bass line in the very intro, but played several octaves higher. And it's, as I'm sure people who've been watching me for a while are aware by this point, I am an absolute sucker for that kind of instrumentation. It's like xylophones and vibraphones and marimbas and that kind of thing. And the rest of the track is just pure emotional and melodic brilliance. Seriously, not enough praises in the world for this track. Unfortunately, the rest of this album doesn't hit quite the same heights as Iambic 5 Poetry, and I think it might almost suffer from coming out of the gate with that, because the rest of the album, it uses like the same drum textures and is similarly echoey, but the rest just does not have the same vibe at all. But despite that, I really don't think the rest of the album is that bad either. I mean, once Iambic 5 Poetry is done, everything basically picks up right where Music is Rotted One Note left off, cut from basically the same cloth. Basically all live instrumentation and going for that same kind of Miles Davis experimental jazz vibe, but leaning more in on the experimentalism, and sounding a little more original too. Like, you could listen to Music is Rotted One Note and could be forgiven in thinking, oh, this is a ripoff of Miles Davis. But this one isn't quite there. It is more a Squarepusher's own thing, I would say. It's definitely a difficult listen, especially with such an easily accessible track starting us off, and with the rest just disappearing right back down into the rabbit hole. Okay, maybe not that fast, but yeah, coming back to it now, the rest of this album was a lot better than I remembered. Like, for instance, we start with Fly Street, which almost kind of sounds like what it would be like if you combined the sounds of Hard Normal Daddy with Music is Rotted One Note. Kind of drugged out and psychedelic, but more fast-paced. I mean, we're not quite into drum and bass territory here, but you get what I mean. There's some very subtle chords in the background that go up against the more manic drum beats. Meanwhile, all of these splashing synths just flowing all over the place. It all creates this very trippy and paranoid effect. Again, coming right off the heels of Iambic 5 Poetry, it's a little unsatisfying. Because, I mean, feels like it's comprised of similar sounds, but the overall, emotional vibe of it just seems to have all the warmth sucked out of it. But it is a really good track out of context. And since I've listened to it on accident a lot because of my love for the first track on here. It makes it stick out in my head more. Yeah, I can remember it better. I give my thumbs up to Fly Street, I would say. Now the rest, you're not going to find much of anything in the way of hooks, but if you were really captivated by Music is Rotted One Note's acid trip atmosphere, the rest of this album delivers on that just as well, if not even more. The Tide has no melody. The drums seem to form something that resembles a pulse, even if a bit irregular, and it's not technically just pure atonality, it's just very dissonant. Synths that just seem to fade in and out of the mix like waves, fitting given the title. It's incredibly creepy, but again, there's just something oddly organic and satisfying about it that just works for me pretty well. And you got Splask, which has these kinds of bell-like sounds on it. Well, not quite. It's more like tapping on some, like, long, fixed hollow metal bar. Might be a water phone or something like that. I'm not sure. And while these sounds just seem to echo into the distance and they're very unnerving, it's brought down to earth a little bit by the presence of some Electric Rhodes pianos, and there's later some cloudy guitar picking to add to the weird, trippy texture of the track. But then we also get two bass hit parentheses dub, which, of course, as you might guess, is covered in Jenkinson's amazing bass playing. Again, not really any melody or hook. It's just jamming, but it sounds great. And Varkatope actually brings in the new build style acid synths again, alongside its watery acoustic drum textures, reminding you that, oh yeah, this came out of an artist known for making IDM in the 90s, didn't it? As rough and aggressive as it is, it weirdly enough has been growing on me as well, and I have fun listening to that one too. It's actually a little on the catchier side, at least by the standards of this album. If there's any track I'm still not super enthused by, it might be the closer, Gong Acid, which is basically a very similarly empty-sounding closer to Last Approach from the previous album, but empty in a different way, like empty in the fact that it's basically just the exact same rhythm played on these little gong things, I would assume, given the title, and the rhythms never change. It's just the speed at which they're being performed, and that's basically it. I mean, the rhythm is good and the track sounds good, but it seems to go on a bit long. It feels like this is just this one idea that was stretched to its limit. But again, it's really not that bad a track when you really get down to it. Again, when you compare it to Last Tap Roach, you can tell what Jenkinson was going for by closing out with this. Heck, I think I might even like Gong Acid more than I like Last Tap Roach, but that's just me. I think I might prefer the chiming gong sounds a little more over the air raid siren of Last Tap Roach, but that's me. But I do still have some issues with this mini-album as a whole that keep me from saying that it's truly great. For one thing, it's basically just a companion to Music Is Rotted One Note. In terms of originality, like, well, you have that one album to compare it to, and it's pretty obvious. It's similarly dark and strange and acid trippy, but also acoustic and organic and flavorful. Any of the tracks on here could have also fit on that album as well. The other problem is, unfortunately, Iambic 5 Poetry. Despite being by miles my favorite track on the album, it's extremely out of place on this thing. Maybe if it were the last track on here, it could have potentially worked, like finally coming out of your long, bad LSD trip into the comforting familiarity of the real world and ending on a warm and fuzzy note. But as an opener, I mean, it's an excuse to come back to the album more often, but it's really god-awful as a tone setter. There's not a single hint of creepiness or acid trip weirdness in that track at all. Well, maybe there is a little bit of acid trip weirdness, but it's like a good LSD trip instead of a bad one, like basically the rest. And it unfairly sets your expectations in the wrong place. Generally, when I'm especially in the mood for Iambic 5 Poetry, which is the majority of the time when I pick up Budakhan Mindphone to listen to in the first place, I'm not going to be in the mood for the rest of the album, and it's going to come off as a dark, uncomfortable, and unsettling thing, and I'll end up coming out of it in a less than warm and fuzzy mood. But I think if you go in knowing exactly what you're getting out of it as a whole, then for the most part Budakhan Mindphone is actually really solid. I would still recommend going to Music Is Rotted One Note versus that's a more interesting and much more well put together release as a whole. And if you really like that, then you'll really like this as well. And even if you didn't, I mean, you can still just get Iambic 5 Poetry and leave the rest to collect metaphorical dust in some folder on your computer. So yeah, highly flawed release right here, but one that I think still deserves more credit as a whole than it probably gets. I'm overall feeling a 7.7 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.